The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of the prestigious military academy as Harold Whitman approached the imposing iron gates. At 73 years old, his steps were slower than they once were. But his posture remained straight, despite the worn clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame. The faded jacket he wore had seen better days, and his shoes, though polished, showed signs of countless miles walked. Harold clutched a small envelope in his weathered hands as he approached the two young guards stationed at the entrance. Their uniforms were crisp and pristine, their boots gleaming in the sunlight. They represented everything the academy stood for: discipline, honor, and excellence. As Harold drew closer, he could see the skeptical looks forming on their faces. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Harold said politely, his voice carrying the distinctive tone of someone who had once commanded respect. "I'm here to see General Morrison. I have something important to deliver to him personally." The first guard, barely 25 years old with close-cropped blonde hair, looked Harold up and down with obvious disdain. His name tag read Corporal Jenkins. He exchanged a knowing glance with his partner, Sergeant Williams, a slightly older man with dark hair and an equally dismissive expression. "Sir, you can't just walk in here demanding to see the general," Corporal Jenkins said with a smirk. "This is a restricted military facility. You need proper identification and an appointment. Besides, General Morrison is an extremely busy man. He doesn't have time for every person who wanders up to our gates." Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old military identification card. The plastic was yellowed with age, and the photograph showed a much younger version of himself in uniform. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "This should be sufficient identification." Sergeant Williams barely glanced at the card before shaking his head. "That's ancient history, old man. This expired decades ago. You need current ID and proper authorization. Now, I suggest you move along before we have to call security." The elderly man's eyes showed a flash of something, not anger, but disappointment. He had expected better from fellow service members. "Young man, I understand you're doing your job, but this matter is urgent. General Morrison will want to see what I have to give him. It concerns his son, Reince." "Reince? His son?" Corporal Jenkins laughed outright. "Listen, we get all kinds of people here with all kinds of stories. Everyone claims to know the general or have some important message. You're not the first person to try this approach, and you won't be the last." Harold's patience was wearing thin, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not asking for much. Just 5 minutes of the general's time. Surely you can at least call his office and let them know I'm here." "We're not calling anyone," Sergeant Williams said firmly. "You need to leave now, or we'll escort you off the premises. The general doesn't have time for whatever sob story you're peddling." Other people began to notice the commotion. A few junior officers walking by slowed their pace to observe the interaction, some shaking their heads at what they assumed was another homeless veteran trying to gain access to the base. The guards seemed to take pride in their firm stance, puffing out their chests as if they were protecting national security itself. Harold tried once more, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone that hinted at his past. "Soldiers, I'm asking you one final time to contact General Morrison's office. Tell them Harold Whitman is here with information about Lieutenant Michael Morrison." The mention of the lieutenant's name caused both guards to stiffen slightly, but their arrogance quickly returned. "How do you know that name?" Corporal Jenkins demanded suspiciously. "Because I served with his father, and I was there when his son was born," Harold replied calmly. "I held that boy when he was just days old." "Right," Sergeant Williams said sarcastically. "And I suppose you're best friends with the president, too. Look, old-timer, we've heard every story in the book. You're not getting past these gates with some made-up connection to the general's family." The crowd of onlookers was growing larger. Some of the younger soldiers seemed uncomfortable with how the guards were treating the elderly man, but military protocol and hierarchy kept them from interfering. The guards, however, seemed energized by the audience. treating the situation as a performance of their authority. "I'm going to count to 10, Corporal Jenkins announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If you're not walking away from these gates by the time I reach 10, we'll have you arrested for trespassing on federal property." Harold stood his ground, his jaw set with determination. The envelope in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Inside was something he had carried for months, waiting for the right moment to deliver it personally to General Morrison. It wasn't just a letter. It was a final message from the general's son, written in the last days of his life during his deployment in Afghanistan. 1, 2, 3. Jenkins began counting, his voice growing louder and more theatrical with each number. The other soldiers watched uncomfortably as the scene unfolded. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the guards were going too far. But military discipline and respect for chain of command kept them silent. The guards were within their rights to protect the entrance, even if their methods seemed harsh. 4, 5, 6. Jenkins continued, clearly enjoying the power he held over the situation. Harold's hands tightened around the envelope. He thought about Michael Morrison, the young lieutenant who had asked him to deliver this final message to his father if anything happened to him. Michael had been like a son to Harold during their deployment, and Harold had promised him with his dying breath that he would complete this mission. 7, 8. The count continued relentlessly. Unknown to everyone present, General Morrison's staff car was approaching the gates from the opposite direction. The general himself sat in the back seat, reviewing papers for his upcoming meeting. He was a distinguished man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had earned every star on his uniform through dedication and sacrifice. 9. Jenkins called out, his hand moving to his radio, to call for backup security. The general's car rounded the corner, bringing him into view of the unfolding confrontation. Through the tinted windows, he could see a crowd gathered at the entrance, and 2 guards confronting an elderly man. Something about the scene struck him as wrong, and he leaned forward to get a better look. 10! Jenkins shouted triumphantly, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for trespassing!" As the guard moved toward Harold, the general's eyes focused on the elderly man's face. Even from a distance, even after all these years, there was something familiar about him. The general's hand instinctively went to the window control, lowering it to get a clearer view. Harold stood perfectly still as the guard approached, dignity intact despite the humiliating situation. He had faced enemy fire, witnessed the horrors of war, and held dying soldiers in his arms. 2 young guards with inflated egos were not going to break his resolve to honor his promise to Lieutenant Morrison. The general's car drew closer to the gates, and his expression began to change from mild curiosity to something approaching recognition. His driver, noticing the commotion, slowed the vehicle as they approached the checkpoint. General Morrison's heart began to race as his car pulled closer to the gates. The elderly man's profile was becoming clearer with each passing second, and a flood of memories began washing over him. The way the man stood, shoulders squared despite his age, the familiar set of his jaw, the bearing that could never be completely erased by time. All of it pointed to an impossible but undeniable conclusion. "Stop the car," the general commanded his driver, his voice tight with emotion. "Sir?" the driver asked, confused by the sudden change in his superior's demeanor. "Stop the car right here." "Now," General Morrison repeated, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding at the gates. As the staff car came to a halt, Corporal Jenkins was reaching for Harold's arm, preparing to place him under arrest. The gathered crowd of soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence, some beginning to question whether they were witnessing something terribly wrong. "You have the right to remain silent," Jenkins began reciting, clearly enjoying his moment of authority over the elderly intruder. Harold didn't resist, but his eyes remained fixed on the envelope in his hands. He thought of young Michael Morrison, barely 24 years old, lying in a hospital bed in Kandahar with shrapnel wounds that would ultimately claim his life. The lieutenant had pressed this envelope into Harold's hands with trembling fingers, making him swear an oath that seemed impossible to fulfill given the current circumstances. General Morrison stepped out of his car, his movement sharp and decisive despite the shock coursing through his system. His aide, Major Peterson, quickly followed. Unsure what had prompted the general's sudden departure from their scheduled route. "General, sir, your meeting with the Joint Chiefs is in 15 minutes, Major Peterson said, checking his watch nervously. But General Morrison wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the man being arrested at his own gates. And with each step closer, his certainty grew. This wasn't just any elderly veteran. This was Master Sergeant Harold Whitman, the man who had saved his life in the jungles of Vietnam over 4 decades ago. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. The ambush that had left Morrison wounded and separated from his unit. Harold finding him 3 days later, barely conscious and burning with fever. The long, dangerous journey back to friendly lines, with Harold carrying him for miles when he was too weak to walk. The field hospital, where Harold had stayed by his bedside until he recovered. "Harold," General Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with unmistakable authority. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every soldier in the area snapped to attention at the sound of the general's voice. Corporal Jenkins froze with the handcuffs halfway to Harold's wrists, suddenly aware that something had gone terribly wrong with his simple arrest procedure. Harold turned at the sound of his name, and for the first time that morning, a smile crossed his weathered face. "Hello, Tommy," he said quietly, using the nickname only a handful of people in the world had ever been permitted to use. The color drained from Corporal Jenkins' face as he realized the magnitude of his error. Sergeant Williams took an involuntary step backward, his mind racing to comprehend how this shabby-looking old man could possibly know their commanding general well enough to call him by a childhood nickname. General Morrison broke into a run, his polished shoes clicking rapidly against the pavement as he closed the distance between them. The crowd of soldiers watched in stunned silence as their commanding officer, a man they had never seen display anything but perfect military composure, openly displayed raw emotion. "Harold Whitman, you magnificent son of a gun," General Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion as he reached the elderly man. "What in God's name are you doing here?" The two men embraced, 43 years of separation dissolving in an instant. Harold felt the strength in the younger man's arms, remembering when he had carried this same person to safety all those years ago when he was just a scared 19-year-old lieutenant fresh out of West Point. Corporal Jenkins stood frozen, the handcuffs still dangling from his fingers, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The other soldiers began whispering among themselves, trying to process what they were witnessing. Their general, the man they revered and feared in equal measure, was embracing the homeless-looking vagrant they had just been prepared to arrest. "I tried to tell them," Harold said quietly, his own voice betraying years of suppressed emotion. "I tried to explain that you would want to see me." General Morrison stepped back, his hands still gripping Harold's shoulders, his eyes taking in the changes that 4 decades had wrought on his old friend. The face was older, more lined, the hair completely gray, but the eyes were the same, steady, intelligent, and filled with the same quiet strength that had gotten them both through hell in the Vietnamese jungle. "Of course I want to see you," General Morrison said, then turned to face the crowd of soldiers with an expression that could have melted steel. "What exactly is going on here?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Major Peterson stepped forward, having quickly pieced together the basic situation from the scattered conversations he had overheard. "Sir, it appears there was a misunderstanding at the gate," he said diplomatically, shooting warning glances at the 2 guards who were now standing at rigid attention, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. "A misunderstanding?" General Morrison's voice took on the tone that had terrified junior officers for the past 2 decades. "Someone explain to me why Master Sergeant Harold Whitman, Medal of Honor recipient and one of the finest soldiers I've ever known, was being arrested at the gates of my own command." The revelation that Harold was a Medal of Honor recipient sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Several soldiers visibly winced, understanding that they had just witnessed a catastrophic failure of judgment and respect. Corporal Jenkins found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sir, he didn't have proper identification. He claimed to know you, but we get people making such claims all the time. We were just following security protocols. Security protocols? General Morrison repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Did you even look at his military ID? Did you make any attempt to verify his claims before deciding to humiliate a man who has given more to this country than both of you combined? Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his career flashing before his eyes. Sir, his ID was expired. Very old. We didn't think it was legitimate. His ID was old because he earned it when you were still in diapers, General Morrison snapped. Master Sergeant Whitman served 3 tours in Vietnam, saved dozens of lives, and was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions above and beyond the call of duty. And you treated him like a common criminal because his ID was old? Harold gently placed a hand on his friend's arm. Tommy, it's all right. They were doing their job as they understood it. But General Morrison was far from finished. The protective instinct he felt for his old friend, combined with his outrage at the treatment Harold had received, was building to a crescendo that would be remembered at this base for years to come. No, Harold, it's not all right, he said firmly. These men failed in their duty not just to you, but to everything this uniform represents. They showed neither respect for their elders nor basic human decency. The general turned back to address the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Let this be a lesson to every soldier here. When a veteran approaches our gates, regardless of how they're dressed or how old their identification might be, they deserve respect and dignity. They've earned it through service and sacrifice that most of you can't even begin to understand. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope he had been clutching throughout the entire ordeal. The paper was slightly crumpled from his tight grip, but the writing on the front remained clear. For General Thomas Morrison, from your son. I came here to give you this, Harold said simply, holding out the envelope. Michael asked me to deliver it personally, if anything happened to him. The color drained from General Morrison's face as he recognized his son's handwriting on the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, understanding in that moment that this wasn't just a social visit from an old friend. This was about his son, Michael, the young lieutenant, currently deployed in Afghanistan. And the implications were devastating. General Morrison's hands shook as he took the envelope from Harold, the weight of it seeming to contain far more than just paper and ink. The handwriting was unmistakably his son's, the same careful script that had written countless letters home during his deployment, the same writing that had filled birthday cards and Father's Day notes throughout Michael's childhood. When? General Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, Harold replied gently. He held on for 2 days after the IED explosion. I was with him at the field hospital in Kandahar. He wanted to make sure this reached you personally. The general's composure, maintained through decades of military discipline, finally cracked. His shoulders sagged as the reality of what Harold was telling him sank in. Around them, the assembled soldiers stood in stunned silence, witnessing their commanding officer receive news that no parent should ever have to hear. Major Peterson stepped closer, ready to offer support if needed, but General Morrison waved him back with a slight gesture. This moment belonged to him and Harold, 2 old soldiers, sharing a burden that only they could understand. He talked about you constantly, Harold continued, his own voice heavy with grief. About how proud he was to follow in your footsteps, about the stories you told him of our time in Vietnam. He said you taught him that a soldier's greatest weapon isn't his rifle or his training, it's his commitment to his brothers in arms. General Morrison carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several pages written in Michael's neat handwriting, along with a small photograph of father and son taken during Michael's graduation from West Point 2 years earlier. He wrote this during his first week in country, Harold explained as the general began to read. He updated it every few weeks, always making sure it said exactly what he wanted you to know if the worst happened. The letter began simply, Dad, if Master Sergeant Whitman is reading this to you, It means I won't be coming home, but I need you to know that I'm not sorry for the choice I made to serve." General Morrison's eyes blurred as he continued reading his son's final words. Michael wrote about the soldiers he served with, about the difference they were making in Afghanistan, about the children who could now attend school because of their presence. He wrote about the pride he felt wearing the same uniform his father had worn, about the lessons in leadership and integrity that had guided him through his darkest moments. But most importantly, Michael wrote about Harold. He described how the older soldier had taken him under his wing during deployment, becoming both mentor and father figure. Harold had shared stories of Vietnam, of serving with General Morrison when he was just a young lieutenant, and of the bond that had formed between them in the crucible of combat. "He saved my life more than once," the letter continued, "just like he saved yours all those years ago. Harold has a gift for finding the good in every situation and the strength in every person. When I was scared, he reminded me of your courage. When I doubted myself, he told me stories of your leadership under fire. He helped me understand that being your son wasn't a burden to live up to, it was a blessing to live out." The general paused in his reading, looking up at Harold with eyes full of gratitude and grief. "You took care of my boy. He took care of all of us," Harold replied. "Michael was the finest young officer I ever served with. He had your courage, your integrity, and your heart. The men would have followed him anywhere." As General Morrison continued reading, the crowd of soldiers began to understand the full magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just the reunion of two old war buddies. This was a sacred moment of connection across generations of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The letter went on to describe Michael's final mission, a convoy escort that had come under attack. Even mortally wounded, he had stayed at his post, directing the defense and ensuring that his soldiers made it to safety. His actions had saved 6 lives, though they had cost him his own. "I don't want you to grieve for me, Dad," the letter concluded. "I want you to remember that I died doing what I believed in, surrounded by brothers who cared for me, and carrying the values you taught me." Harold promised to deliver this personally because he understands the sacred nature of promises between soldiers. "Trust him as you would trust me. Take care of him as he took care of your son." The letter was signed simply, "Your loving son, Lieutenant Michael Morrison, United States Army." General Morrison folded the pages carefully and placed them back in the envelope. When he looked up, his eyes were dry but filled with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. He turned to address the assembled soldiers, his voice strong despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Gentlemen, you have just witnessed something that every soldier should understand," he began. "Master Sergeant Whitman traveled over 1,000 miles, at his own expense and despite his advancing age, to fulfill a promise made to my son. This is what brotherhood means. This is what honor looks like. This is why we serve." He turned to Corporal Jenkins and Sergeant Williams, who were still standing at rigid attention, their faces pale with the understanding of their massive error in judgment. "As for you two," General Morrison continued, his voice taking on steel, "you will both report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. We will have a long conversation about judgment, respect, and the true meaning of military courtesy. Your conduct today has been a disgrace to this uniform and to the soldiers who came before you." Both guards nodded stiffly, knowing that their careers had just taken a dramatic turn for the worse. General Morrison then turned back to Harold, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Harold Whitman, you are a guest of honor at this base, for as long as you choose to stay. Major Peterson will ensure you have quarters, meals, and anything else you need." "That's very kind, Tommy, but I should probably head home," Harold said quietly. "I just needed to keep my promise to Michael." "No," General Morrison said firmly. "You're not leaving just yet. We have 43 years to catch up on. And I want to hear every story you can tell me about my son's final months. Besides, there's a ceremony tomorrow morning where I'm presenting awards to several junior officers. I want you there, in the place of honor, so these young soldiers can see what a real hero looks like." Real hero. Real hero. Real hero. Looks like. The crowd began to disperse, but not before each soldier took a long, thoughtful look at Harold. Word of what had transpired spread quickly throughout the base. And by evening, Harold's story, both his heroic service in Vietnam and his faithful delivery of the letter, had become legend. That night, General Morrison and Harold sat in the general's quarters, sharing stories and memories late into the evening. Harold spoke of Michael's courage, his leadership, and his deep love for his father. General Morrison shared memories of Harold's heroism in Vietnam and the profound impact their friendship had on his life and career. The next morning, at the awards ceremony, General Morrison introduced Harold to the assembled troops as a man who embodies the finest traditions of military service, courage in battle, loyalty to his brothers, and faithfulness to his promises. The applause was thunderous and heartfelt. Corporal Jenkins and Sergeant Williams, after their meeting with General Morrison, became the most courteous and respectful guards the base had ever known. They had learned a lesson about dignity, respect, and the true cost of service that would stay with them for the rest of their military careers. As for Harold, he accepted General Morrison's invitation to stay for a week, during which he spoke to several groups of young soldiers about service, sacrifice, and the bonds that unite all who wear the uniform. His simple dignity and quiet wisdom left a lasting impression on everyone he met. When Harold finally prepared to leave, General Morrison walked him to the very gates where he had almost been arrested days before. The same guards who had treated him so poorly now stood at respectful attention, offering crisp salutes as he passed. "Thank you, Harold," General Morrison said as they reached the entrance. "For everything. For saving my life in Vietnam, for taking care of Michael, for bringing me his final words, and for reminding us all what true honor looks like." Harold smiled, the same quiet smile that had comforted wounded soldiers in 2 different wars. "We take care of our own, Tommy. That's what soldiers do. That's what we've always done." As Harold walked away from the base, his mission complete, the guards watched with newfound respect and understanding. They had learned that heroism doesn't always wear a pressed uniform or carry current identification. Sometimes it arrives in worn clothes and weathered hands, carrying nothing more than a promise and the determination to keep it. The story of the elderly stranger and the general became part of base lore, passed down to new soldiers as an example of honor, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in service to country. And whenever young guards felt tempted to judge someone by their appearance rather than their character, they remembered the day they almost arrested a Medal of Honor recipient for trying to keep a sacred promise to a fallen soldier. The envelope Michael Morrison had written was framed and placed in his father's office, where it served as a daily reminder of love, loss, and the enduring power of keeping one's word. And Harold Whitman, the faithful messenger who had traveled so far to deliver it, became a legend in his own right. Proof that true soldiers never stop serving, never stop caring, and never stop keeping their promises to their brothers in arms.